right, it looks like we are just about there. So good afternoon. Just wanted to welcome you on behalf of Protect Democracy and Interfaith America. I'm Chris Crawford. I'm a policy strategist with Protect Democracy, and want to start by thanking our friends at Interfaith America for your partnership on the Faith and Elections Playbook. You all have been just wonderful partners. Thank you for hosting this today. Thank you to our panelists for being here, and especially thank you to all of you who are tuning in, trying to figure out ways to do this work to increase faith in elections in your communities. So thank you for taking the time today. We're going to start our programming with a special message from Utah's Lieutenant Governor, Diedre Henderson. And she sent us a video that we're going to play. It's a few minutes long to just frame some of the conversation here from the perspective of someone who is charged with running elections in one of our states. So we will start with the Lieutenant Governor, and then on the other side, I'll introduce the Faith and Elections Playbook and then hand it over to our experts.
Hi, I'm Utah Lieutenant Governor Diedre Henderson. It's with great pleasure that I welcome religious leaders from across the country for the Faith and Elections Playbook Conference. In my role as Lieutenant Governor, I serve as Utah's Chief Election Officer, a responsibility I take very seriously. One of the greatest challenges we face today is the decline of public trust, especially in government institutions such as elections. At times, it feels like divisive and inaccurate rhetoric spreads faster than truth. But during the past 3 years, I've witnessed the impact of respected community leaders such as yourselves who resolve to be builders of public trust. As we enter the 2024 election season, we are relying on you to help your communities understand the importance of civic responsibility. Part of that responsibility is not just engagement, but how we engage. It's more important than ever to remember that it's not disagreement, but contempt that will divide and destroy us. Our faith communities hold the answers to overcoming individual feelings of contempt, which will in turn increase our trust in each other and in the institutions that hold our country together. In his wonderfully insightful book, Love Your Enemies: How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt, Arthur Brooks recalls a conversation in which he asked the Dalai Lama how to overcome feelings of contempt. The answer was simple, but powerful. The Dalai Lama told Brooks, "When you feel contempt, practice warm-heartedness." Although it's important to practice more civility, the answer to contempt that divides and threatens to destroy our country isn't more civility, it's more warm-heartedness. We rely on religious leaders everywhere to set the tone for political discourse this year by providing accurate information and helping the rest of us recognize that we can and must do our own small parts. Today, you will discuss how you can share accurate information with your congregations, build bridges across differences, and ensure strong relationships between election officials and community leaders. Religious leaders are the ones our communities turn to for guidance and trustworthy information. You have an essential role in making sure people know where and how to vote, where to turn for information, and how to treat each other with dignity, respect, and love. We have a lot of work to do to educate and sow the seeds of trust ahead of the November elections. Thank you for what you are doing and how you're doing it.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and we thank the Lieutenant Governor for her message, a very well-produced message, as well as a really interfaith message in the way that she framed the conversation. And I especially appreciate that she rooted that message in appreciation for all of you. What I'd like to do now is briefly walk you all through a little bit on what the Faith and Elections Playbook is, and then we'll turn it over to the discussion. So the Faith and Election Playbook, you can find this on Interfaith America's website at interfaithamerica.org. What we want to do with this playbook is to provide a one-stop shop for all of you to find nonpartisan ways that faith-based organizations and nonprofits can take action to help increase trust in elections. The site includes overviews of needs that we've identified, as well as the activities, how-to guides, frequently asked questions, templates for activities, and other information to give you all what you need. So why the Faith and Elections Playbook? Why are we interested in faith communities? Especially at Protect Democracy, we are not a faith-inspired organization. One of the reasons we're doing this is in response to a lack of trust in the electoral process. And the polarization that's affecting communities plays a large role in that, and they're sort of intertwined. We know that people of faith play an essential role in their communities. And a lot of people are interested in the nonpartisan ways that they can get involved, but they're not sure where to start, or they might be overwhelmed with some of the different options that might be out there. So we wanted to make this toolkit of strategies, lists of resources, providing a menu of options to meet the unique community needs that you all face. What I especially like about this work that we're doing is it's designed to give you the options to empower all of you to find what action can you take in line with your values, in line with your skill sets, and in line with the needs of your communities. If you were at our webinar a few weeks ago, we talked about a few of the items that are on the website. We talked about some of the more action-oriented ones, the recruiting poll workers, offering space for polling locations, supporting voters to have a safe, positive voting experience. What we're going to talk about today are really getting at the second piece of trust in elections, addressing polarization, building relationships with local election officials, and sharing trustworthy information, because religious leaders, especially at the community level, are so well trusted by voters. I also want to note here that we want to be as helpful as we can to all of you, not just with the resources of the website, but we're raising money to get you financial resources to do this work. So you can go to the link here at interfaithamerica.org and apply for grants as well to support your efforts. And with that, I will introduce our first panelist. And before I do that, actually, a quick note on housekeeping. Please feel free to post in the chat as we go any questions that you have, and we'll switch to Q&A at the end, and we'll go through the questions. I might ask them, or we might call on folks to ask your questions, but we want to invite you to ask questions during the Q&A at the end. So now I'll turn it over to Justin Giboney, who is a good friend, a wonderful leader. He's an attorney and political strategist based in Atlanta, Georgia. He's the founder and president of the AND Campaign, which is an organization that educates and organizes Christians for civil and cultural engagement that results in better representation, more just and compassionate policies, and a healthier political future. And I should also note that the AND Campaign just had a grant application accepted, so they will be one of the grantees of the Faith and Elections Playbook grant. And I'll hand it over to you, Justin.
Thanks, Chris. As always, it's great to be a partner with you and Protect Democracy. Also, greatly appreciate Interfaith America, Becca, and everyone. Just thank you all for the invitation. This is a much needed conversation, especially during an election year where there is a high, maybe even a probability in some cases of kind of political violence, where people are so polarized that we just can't see any common ground or see any way to go forward without getting rid of the other side. And that's no way to run a democracy. And so even though we're in a diverse and pluralistic society, I think one of the things we need to realize is that to some extent, even those of us who are doing the best that we can, we do live in bubbles. We live to some extent in these echo chambers. And it's not necessarily all our fault. I think we can, to some extent, blame algorithms, and we can blame news polarization and things of that nature. But whether or not it's all our fault, I think we do have a responsibility to try to fix it. I think we have a responsibility to recognize the bubbles that we're in, because those bubbles can severely limit our perspectives and really cause us to dismiss others and not have enough connectivity with others. I think it was Axios who recently released a article that was about the 12 media bubbles that most people find themselves in. So this is for people who find themselves getting their news from Twitter or Instagram, all the way to those who get their news from cable news, or some people aren't keeping up at all. And the big problem with having these separate media bubbles, no longer do we have our Walter Cronkites and things of that nature, is that sometimes it almost presents us with two completely different realities. And that makes it very hard for us to see other people's problems in a real way, and also to take those problems as seriously as we should. Now, it's difficult, if not impossible, to effectively love your neighbor in the public square or in a real way if we don't have any conversations and connections across difference. And so I want to talk about why it is very important for us to have connections and conversations across difference if we're going to move forward in a healthy way. So I'll kind of give maybe 4 or 5 reasons why this is very important. Now, eventually, I'm going to appeal to your heart, but I want to start off by appealing to your self-interest. And we all know that we live in a constitutional republic, and in a democracy of sorts, you have to persuade people. And if you're in the public square and you actually want to get things done, if you see issues that mean a lot to you and you actually want some movement on those issues, very rarely these days can you get movement on an issue just within your small circle. And so if you don't talk to people who are different than you, if you're not having conversations and informing them on why these issues are important, it makes it very difficult to get movement, even on the issues that you care about the most. Now, in the past, maybe there were 1 or 2 groups who could get things done without having to go to other communities. But I actually think that it's healthy to have to be able to do that in a democracy. And if we look at the civil rights movement and things like that, we see that there was a major effort to go to people in other faith groups, other communities, other races to say, hey, this is why this is important. And this is why this affects all of us and affects our country as a whole. So the first reason I would say is a very practical reason for those who may not connect with the more heart focused reasons is to get things done. You need to have conversations and you need to be able to persuade. A democracy is about persuasion. It is not about compelling people to do what you want them to do. It's about helping them understand why that's the best option. And I truly believe that no matter who you are, no matter what your background is, in this country, you should have a voice and you should have an equal opportunity to persuade others. But that takes conversations and also takes organizing to get that critical mass of people to follow you in doing that. Another reason is, without communication across difference, we are more likely to treat people like political abstractions rather than people with an innate dignity. And I think Chloe Valdery, with her theory of enchantment, does a very good job of talking about the problem that we're presented with when we treat people merely as a political abstraction or just, kind of a piece on a chessboard, on a political chessboard, rather than really engaging with their human dignity and their bigger story. We tend to flatten reality. We tend to flatten the identity and experiences of others. And then we take shortcuts and define people completely by their race, by their political party, by their sexual orientation, or by who they voted for. So we begin, if we listen to one side for long enough, or if we just stay within our echo chamber, we really believe we know who certain people are almost completely based on who they voted for, based on their political party. And that is very dangerous because that tells us very little at the end of the day about who somebody is. When we treat others like political abstractions, the other thing is that we begin to have contempt for them. We see them as worthless and not capable of making a valuable contribution to what's going on. And one of my favorite preachers of old, Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor, talks about a time that he was in Texas and a cab driver came to pick him up, somebody who would probably be considered, just based on his looks, as a redneck. And so when he got into the cab with this guy, he was ready. He was kind of on edge. He was ready to attack. And the first thing that the guy said to him as they drove off, he said, "Hey, did you hear what happened today?" He said, "I didn't hear what's going on." He said, "They shot Martin Luther King Jr." And this was Samuel DeWitt Proctor's friend. And who would have known that this man that he had already judged, that he had already figured that he knew what he was about and he must have been racist just based on how he looked, was actually the one that told him that his friend had been killed. And so they pulled over the car and they cried together. And it just shows that we know very little about people based on what they look like or what their profile is. Everybody is dealing with the human condition. These are people who are dealing with heartbreak, addiction, abuse, insecurity. And we never know that. And we can never take that as seriously as we should if we're not willing to connect with people across difference. Here's another reason. We tend to communicate through messengers. Progressive-leaning people may learn the most that they know about conservatives through progressive cable news, and vice versa. Conservatives learn the most that they know about progressives through conservative cable news and things of that nature. And to get to really know what somebody actually thinks, I'm just going to tell you, those aren't great sources. A much better way is to have a conversation with someone and see what they're really about. We tend to argue with people and again, have contempt for people based on misrepresentation, based oftentimes on caricatures. One of the things that is unfortunate is we will get into an argument with someone and really feel like they are the bad guys and we're the good guys, without even knowing what good they're trying to accomplish. And so even if you think somebody's conclusion is wrong, even if you think they go about it the wrong way, in order to really have a conversation with them, to really argue against what they're saying, you at least have to know what good they're attempting to achieve. Most people aren't completely malicious. There's some good that they're approaching and trying to pursue. And even if they're wrong, unless you know what that is, you can't really have a constructive conversation with them. Something else I appreciate is what John Stuart Mill once said. He said that he who knows only his side of the case knows very little of that. His reasons may be good and no one may be able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. To really be confident in your opinion, to really know what the other side is going on, you get what's going on the other side. You need to actually have conversations with those people, not just accept misrepresentations, not just accept characters, and not allow others, even on your side of the conversation, present the worst arguments. Sometimes we do not get to the best arguments on the other side because we haven't taken the time to really listen and go past the messengers straight to the people who are talking. And one thing that I would say to everyone here, again, this isn't about agreeing with the other side or acting or kind of bringing about a false equivalence, but it is to say that if you don't believe that there are well-intended and very intelligent people on the other side, you haven't done your due diligence. All right. Here's something else that's very important. Now, this might come as a surprise to some of you, but no group, meaning no party, no race, no ideological tribe, etc., gets everything right. And we have to come to terms with that. And one of the only ways sometimes that we can come to terms with that is actually hearing people out on the other side and having a sort of intellectual humility to hear what they're trying to say and understand what they do get right. Most of us can run down a long list of what the other side gets wrong. But do we have a long list of what we have gotten wrong or our side has gotten wrong presently and historically? And I would say, especially to people of faith, most of the faiths that I know and understand don't accept us being indoctrinated by ideologies and things of that nature. And how can we prevent ourselves, or how can we even know if we're not indoctrinated, if we're unable to identify what we get wrong? And in identifying what we get wrong, it should bring about a certain humility. It should open up our eyes to see that maybe the people we disagree with all the time, even if they're 95% wrong, that 5% still matters, and we need to be able to identify that. So again, I want to be very clear. Nothing in what I'm saying is to say that there's not going to be conflict, that there's not going to be tension. I truly believe that there are ideas and movements and sometimes individuals who need to be confronted, who need to be held accountable. This isn't to say that everybody's okay. There are ideas that deserve a public and democratic death, right? Because they would hurt people. But we can do that and at the same time respect people, and at the same time make sure that we're having conversations across difference and building relationships. Thank you for your time.
Wow. Thank you very much, Justin. I'm going to put in the chat here, Justin provided a very good overview here of the issue of polarization. And I'm just sharing the section in the chat here on polarization and relationships across difference that's in the Faith and Elections Playbook. There are, I think, about a dozen organizations guides in there, so you can find the right one for your communities, whether it's having conversations within your congregations or your networks, about polarization and the differences there, or across different institutions, different religious lines. So thank you very much for teeing up that conversation, Justin. And now we're going to go to Ben Ginsberg, who's been referred to as a Republican super lawyer for his past work with the Republican Party and for multiple GOP nominees for president. And Ben has also been doing a lot of bipartisan work in recent years, including co-chairing the Bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration. He's now the Volker Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he runs an organization called the Election Officials Legal Defense Network. And he is also the newest member of the National Task Force on Election Crises, which is something that I also staff in my work at Protect Democracy, and we very much appreciate his engagement with that organization. Ben also has a new project called Pillars of the Community that helps to build trust in our relationships by building in our elections, by building relationships between election officials and their communities. And he has been a great voice on trying to help increase trust in elections and is an expert on a variety of legal areas around elections. So Ben, we are so grateful that you're here today.
Being included in this discussion, which is so important for all of us who are citizens of the country. Let me amplify some of the things that Justin touched on in sort of the practical arena of helping out the running of elections by forging relationships with election officials. First, I want to congratulate Chris and Protect Democracy and Interfaith America for really being engaged on this subject, which is so absolutely crucial. I mean, we are here at a time when between 30 and 35% of the country does not have faith in the reliability of elections. And in that context, you can see some real danger signals for the preservation of the constitutional republic or our democracy. And it's really important that we all get engaged with that to sort of save the situation. It is part of all of our duty to do that. I do believe that, but it is often hard to figure out how to translate that duty into practical actions. And the playbook that you've all seen really provides some excellent ways to be able to get involved in this really crucial activity. In terms of cultivating relationships with election officials, that's a subject near and dear to me. I did spend 4 decades in the trenches as a fierce partisan, but in that context also recognized that election administration and the way we put on our elections needs to be approached in a bipartisan fashion with bipartisan buy-in if people are to have faith in elections, which undergird the peaceful transfer of power that is just a bedrock principle of the way our government operates. As part of that, I was a co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration with my Democratic colleague, Bob Bauer. We had each been counsels for the presidential campaigns in 2012, and we took on the project to make voting easier and more secure at the same time. In the course of preparing our report, we spent a lot of time talking to election officials. And we came to see, in a way we hadn't appreciated as partisan warriors, that election officials play such a crucial and inherited role in making our system of government work. They are people of the community. They are your neighbors and friends. Yet it is a job that when things go right, election officials get no credit. But when things go wrong, they are placed in a very bright and uncomfortable spotlight and really criticized. And of course, in 2020, it was one of those times when they came under the bright, unrelenting spotlight. And there was actual harassment of election officials, both in the job that they did and that carried over into their personal life. Both Bob Bauer and I thought that the charges were by and large unproven and unfair. And so we wanted to help out those election officials for which we had come to know and to really respect. So we did a couple of things. One was set up a legal defense fund for election officials. We have a network of lawyers who provide pro bono services for them. Often we do this in a very cross-partisan fashion just because of the sort of dynamics of the situations in which we find ourselves. And it is important to be able to support local election officials. And this is one way we could send the message that your backs are covered under this. We realized, however, that what we were doing was treating a symptom of a somewhat much more problematic disease, and that's the partisan strife and lack of belief in the credibility of elections. And so we formed, as Chris mentioned, the Pillars of the Community program. And that's one in which we thought it was important because that 30 to 35% number not having confidence in elections is something that needs to be dealt with. It combines that with election officials telling us they really need more support from the community, which is, I think, a truly important notion for all of you to remember as you plan your activities to help out with elections. And we also came to realize that the national atmosphere around elections is really poisonous, but on a local level, there's much more pride in and knowledge that it needs to be a peaceful community. So peace and prosperity in an individual community is important to the people we've recruited as our pillars. We've conducted this program in the 6 most contentious election jurisdictions in the country, and the goal is to collect a bipartisan group of leaders of the community. So we have faith leaders, veterans, businessmen, educators, sports figures, all arrayed around a table with election officials. And our ask for the pillars of the community is that they kick the tires of the election system, that they verify that the safeguards in the system do provide accurate election results, not who wins or loses. It's not about various legislation or litigation projects. It is about really kicking the tires of the election system, all 11 stages of it, to learn about the safeguards. And once they're comfortable that the safeguards work and that the election system works, and they will be tutored by the election officials themselves and have really pretty great access to the inner workings of the election system, that the pillars come out and provide support for the accuracy of our elections. And so part of the essentials of the Pillars program is getting people across the political spectrum, 20 to 30 people per community, but we are being sure that all parts of the political spectrum are at the table, because it is so important to have conversations across the political spectrum, in this case, specifically with people who have the greatest doubts. And if there's a failure in what we've done so far and need to do in the next 200 days, it is to have those conversations across the political spectrum. One thing about your involvement on the local level, the election officials who we work with and support have come to realize since 2020 the value in transparency about their systems. And so if you do have doubts about the accuracy of elections or know people who do, election officials really will be willing to let you kick the tires of how they do things. And it's really important to be able to do that. And if you have doubts, to satisfy the doubts as opposed to just talking in bubbles about how terrible things are. There are a number of ways that you as individuals in your communities can also help out election officials. Becoming a poll worker, recruiting poll workers is something that election officials are looking for help on and want help. You can also take the time to kick the tires of the election system yourself. And then if there are attacks on the accuracy of the election system, be willing to stand up publicly and support those election officials who really will be looking for support from people in the community about their election systems. If you happen to be a business owner or know business owners and are working with them, the things that your playbook lists as things to do bears emphasizing. Let employees work as poll watchers and poll workers, give employees flexibility to vote and the day off to be able to help with elections, provide spaces for voting centers are all really crucial. So let me conclude by again thanking you for your involvement in this project and this process. It really is so important to the basic workings of our government and our system. And I hope you all do get involved and get people in your community involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You hit on so many important points there. And I want to direct people to the chat as well, just for some resources here. Ben mentioned recruiting poll workers, and we have a link with Power the Polls that makes it very easy for folks to sign up. Also wanted to share our page on, at a high level, building relationships with election officials and why that's important. And then also we have a specific one-pager that is really zoomed in on the steps that you can take and the best practices that we did in partnership with A More Perfect Union, which is an organization that serves Jewish communities, and they're on our advisory board. Ben and I are actually also on their advisory board, and they were very helpful in the development of all of these resources, but that one in particular. And speaking of people who were extremely helpful in putting together the Faith and Elections Playbook, our next speaker is Emma Addams, and she was on our advisory committee for this project. And what I want to call out that was especially helpful in her leadership on our advisory committee was, as we were drafting, she made sure that this was accessible in a way that when we talked about leaders who can use this resource, she talked about making sure that it reflected lay leaders in religious communities, not just the people running nonprofits or clergy, but everyday people who can take a leadership role based on their faith. And that's very much in line with the values of Emma's organization, Mormon Women for Ethical Government. And Emma is the co-executive director of Mormon Women for Ethical Government, or MWEG. MWEG is a great organization, and she's going to talk a little bit about sharing accurate information. And MWEG did this so well in 2020 that when I was helping groups, both faith-based and non-faith-based, in the lead up to the 2020 election, I was even sending secular partners who were asking, where's the good information that I can use on misinformation? We were sending them to Mormon Women for Ethical Government for their information. So I've now inflated you so much, Emma, that I might have set a high bar, but you always reach it. So please share your wisdom with the group.
Thanks, Chris. So glad to be here with you today. We at MWEG have just thoroughly enjoyed our collaboration with Interfaith America and Protect Democracy. And I'm so happy to be presenting along our wonderful panelists. And you'll see there's lots of intersections between what I'm going to say and what they've just taught you. I wanted to start out by expressing a huge thank you to our MWEG Media Literacy Director, Meredith Gardner. She oversees the creation of all of our media literacy materials and helped prepare a lot of this presentation, as well as Megan Woods, our Director of Nonpartisanship, who's on this call, helped review. As Chris said, one of the beauties of the principles and ideas that I'm going to share with you from the Faith and Elections Playbook is that they can be applied to any individual or institution. We really believe that we each have a role to play in sharing good information about elections, whether we're a leader of a faith institution or a faith-based congregation, a lay leader within a congregation, or an individual who makes this a priority in her life. Maybe the family group text chat is one of the areas you could influence. So I really invite you to see yourself as a purveyor of truth and who does it in such a way that creates more peace in the world. In the time I have, I'm going to touch briefly on our media literacy philosophy at MWEG, the specific importance of finding and sharing trustworthy information during an election, and the important role that faith-based organizations and people of faith in particular can play in spreading accurate information and grounding people in hope. We at MWAG have always seen our media literacy skills as peacemaking skills. And in that way, my remarks are really beautifully connected with the words that both Justin and Ben have just shared. We have a lot of on-the-ground experience in this. MWAG began as a Facebook group with a handful of women, under a dozen, who had different political opinions, and they were from across the political spectrum. And then within a week, it had grown to 1,000, and it was 4,000 within a month. And so we discovered pretty early on that in order to facilitate both conflict resolution and move towards true peace, we needed to prioritize the seeking and sharing of trustworthy information. You can't have real and lasting peace unless you have a foundation of shared truth. But how we go about doing that is incredibly important. Peacemakers approach the sharing of information with humility and compassion, much in the same way that Justin described approaching one another's in acts of bridge building. It's the humility to recognize our own biases and acknowledges the ways that we might be wrong, or when sometimes we need more information. And this is then paired with compassion for others in their different experiences. And especially if we believe they're accessing and sharing incorrect information, it's especially important to work hard to stay in relationship with them and to focus on maintaining connection rather than seeing ourselves as a constant source of correction. Our MWAG principles of ethical government state that all individuals have a duty to educate themselves about the actions of government officials and current events in the world, taking care to ascertain facts from reliable sources of information. We really recognize there's a decrease of trust in institutions, including news organizations, and that people feel it is increasingly difficult to ascertain the truth. However, we can't be aware of the needs of our neighbors and work towards positive peace and justice if we don't have an honest sense of what's happening in the world. But the reality is we can't be experts at everything and we can't be everywhere. So we each have to rely on established sources of information to help us discern truth. There are so many organizations that provide information about and related to elections that are generally reliable and published with high ethical standards in mind. There are organizations like religious institutions that create a sense of community and foster trust among people. So we work hard to encourage voters to be proactive and intentional as we consume and create information, especially during an election season. And we really are asking faith communities to be proactive in assisting them. So let's talk for a moment about the importance of finding trustworthy information. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the negatives that can come, and I promise you I will get to the positives. Mis and disinformation creates huge barriers to the election process. It can prevent people from accessing the polls, mislead voters about voter registration processes, polling locations, voting times, and dates. This can be accomplished through robocalls, through memes and images, through videos, and through social media posts that are intentionally misleading and then oftentimes shared with those who don't mean to mislead, but are unintentionally sharing it. Mis and disinformation can keep people from wanting to be civically engaged. It breeds a lack of trust. We worry about the integrity of the polls, the voting results, and the election officials. That's all very intentional by those who are creating it. Oftentimes, a fire hose of so much information can lead to overwhelm. It shouldn't be a full-time job to be a citizen. We should be able to get what we need to, do what we need to do without feeling like we all need to be professionals at it. As Justin talked about so beautifully, it increases polarization. And then something we've seen a lot among our membership is mis and disinformation can create a sense of news burnout. It's like, why do I even try? There's just too much. It really prevents people from finding good information and making informed decisions. And mis and disinformation is really actually often aimed at creating chaos and inviting violence and escalating the decline of community. We give up hope. We worry that is there anything true out there? It plays on our emotions and our biases. And then it leads us to make decisions based on misconceptions and false narratives. And it particularly harms marginalized groups, especially those that are the target of voter intimidation and discrimination. So the good news here is that faith-based institutions, people of faith, community members, we all can be places of trust, but faith institutions in particular and organizations are really institutions of trust and community, and we can play an important role in ensuring people have accurate information about elections. But then also we can play a role by grounding people in hope, peace, and love of neighbor. And this makes us less vulnerable to this information as because our starting place is less cynical and prone. So just a couple of things I'll run through from the Faith and Elections Playbook that you can find there, but that will help think about maybe kind of get your wheels turning on what you can do as an individual or as a leader. Be a touch point for marginalized groups if you have a voice of trust there. provide basic trustworthy information about voting, how to register to vote, how to check the status of registration, how, when, and where, how mail-in ballots, how to request, return, and check, who to call if you have questions about voting or problems at the polls. Help people know where to find answers about what's on their ballot, the voting process, and election results. One of the best places to point people to is Secretary of State offices, county election offices, and well-established, reliable local news outlets. It is perfectly possible for a 501c3 institutions to provide information about voting in this way. It's absolutely within legal bounds. It's just the most important thing is that we don't present information that privileges one candidate or party over another. That's when we start to get into trouble. I want to just point out a couple of the particular things that MWAKE has worked on as we've thought about media literacy through this lens of peacemaking. And that is that we need to be individually conscious about the impact of what we consume and we create and we share. So we would invite you to consider providing educational resources and or facilitating discussions about media literacy. And we have a toolkit I can put in the chat. Some of the things that we found have been very successful in helping our membership and those who follow us to become more media literate, to become better purveyors of truth, is to work on identifying bias, both in yourself and in the sources that you read, to make a practice of getting information from a variety of sources and perspectives. It doesn't have to be 10 or 12. It can be a few. It can be a handful. Really, there are certain skills that can be developed around checking sources, having a healthy degree of skepticism and checking in on what we're reading and where it's coming from and who's creating it. And then really, in conclusion, I just want to end with talking about how media can help or hinder our peacemaking. For us, and I think for those on the call who've spoken so far, I think that viewing media literacy through this lens of peacemaking can really transform our interactions with others. And it also inspires me personally and the women that I work with to do this important work, even when it feels quite discouraging, even when we feel like we're being hit with that fire hose, even when we feel like those around us are sharing information that is, incredibly problematic and creates chaos. We can actually resist the pull to chaos and contention by committing ourselves to to access and share trustworthy information. And it's important to do it in a way that invites rather than shames others. And there's really no more important time to do this than right now during an election year. And I'm just so grateful for Interfaith America and Protect Democracy for pulling together this important resource to guide us, and thankful to all of you for being part of this. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you to all of our panelists. Before we get to questions, I want to just note a couple of things here. Emma talked about the tax rules, which I think is really important, and that's something that we hear a lot of hesitation from folks about. And we have vetted the entire Faith and Elections Playbook, that the activities are 501c3. So we want to make sure everyone knows that. I also have done trainings for faith groups on C3 versus C4, what you're allowed to do as houses of worship or C3 organizations. And I'd be happy to do that for folks if they are interested in following up in that way. I'll put my email in the chat. And just big picture, I want to note something that I think is really great. There was so much, whether we use the term grace or not, so much grace given to people who might view things differently than the panelists here. And I think it's especially great because the four of us are all different denominations or religions, come at this from different political perspectives. I think we might even cover at least 3 time zones right now, maybe 4 time zones right now. So I love that some of the themes that the Lieutenant Governor talked about at the start of the conversation were really present throughout the conversation. So we will turn now to some questions in the chat. We'll go with Kelly's first because the other ones were submitted beforehand. So we'll go with the one submitted here. How do you go about curating trustworthy news sources? And I think I'll direct that right back to you, Emma. That might have been specifically for you while you were speaking.
Yeah, I think there might be a little bit of trial and error to that, and not being afraid to kind of try sources that are outside of perhaps your usual bubbles. One rule of thumb that I try to do for myself personally is I try to make sure I'm reading things every day that make me a little bit uncomfortable. Not necessarily things that I'm not looking for things that make me enraged, right? That's not discomfort. That's actually compelling me towards anger. But the things that really kind of force me to question my own biases, people who have different opinions. I think one of the most basic skills that we work on at MWAG that I think is provide the foundation for this is really getting a keen sense and the skills of differentiating between opinion and news. And once you start with that, you're able to kind of build your sources around kind of those two things. And it can be tricky, but I think if it's tricky, it means that the source you're reading, it might actually be trying to hide something. So if you can't tell if it's opinion or news, that is sometimes a good sense that maybe they are trying to compel you to think a certain way. So, good solid news organizations, of which there are so many out there, will make that distinction very clear. There's a variety of ways to do it, and we have some toolkits on our Instagram and our website that show that. But those are kind of some foundational skills. And then beyond that, there are things like, reverse Google search image, like all sorts of reverse Google searches you can do. There's a series of skills that you can develop to do that. But I think also asking your friends and neighbors what they listen to and read can provide you with sometimes some options to check out. And you may check out some of them and you're like, no, thank you. But at least you kind of know what they're reading.
Thank you, Emma. I'd add one more thing when we're especially talking about elections and trust in elections, which is try to go as closely as you can back to the source of election officials, of government sources, because in an election environment, none of us have the capacity to chase down every false story and respond to it. So what's helpful is on the front end, help people understand where they can turn whenever they have questions to get the accurate information. And that's something that we have throughout the playbook on this topic, is how to find the trustworthy information that you can go to around election information. And trying to get back, when you're reading a news story, back to the primary source is really a helpful way as well. Even fact checkers that I read, I sort of go to the bottom, find the links of, okay, what was the original source here? And I find that really helpful. I'll go to the next question that I see that was submitted before the webinar, which is, how do I encourage others to vote for the overall protection of democracy instead of a single or even handful of issues? I don't know if Ben or Justin, if one of you wants to take that. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I want to stay as the moderator for now.
Yeah.
But
one thing that I've found to be effective in doing that is just showing people how most issues are not on an island, right? Even one issue voters, if they look hard enough and kind of drill beneath the surface, you'll find that there are a lot of other issues that overlap or that have an impact on the issue that you care about. The other thing is, hardly any of this stuff matters if there's no democracy. And so there needs to be a democracy to protect people, and helping people understand that things can get a lot worse without some of the protections and the structures that we have. So it is great to want change. It's great to push for change. But if we do our homework historically, if we look around to other places, things can get worse. And so to have the protections that we have, even when we want to change things, we need to realize the protections that we have and that those are blessings and deserve, we need them to be protected.
Chris, if I could add, I do think that in the election area, there is a pretty good way to be able to check that. If people are discouraged about elections and how to protect democracy, there is so much being said and written about the reliability of elections that you can go to your local election officials and do your own sort of fact check about it. In other words, there is a lot of information, both publicly available on websites from election officials, where you can contrast what various partisan actors are saying with what the election officials are saying. And as I mentioned before, election officials are going to be willing to let people come in and kind of road test the accuracy of statements about their elections and therefore democracy.
thank you both. And Justin basically said what I was going to say, but he said it better than I would have. So I'm glad that you went first. The next question that I see here is another one from a participant. What strategies do you suggest for encountering friends and family who have lost hope in the electoral process? I don't know if anyone's especially energized by that on our panel.
I think pushing them back towards exactly what Ben was just saying, take a look at what's happening locally in your election process. I think it's really hard not to feel hope when you encounter poll workers and election judges. I think we've got at least one on this call who are giving of their time and are your friends, your neighbors. And so I think kind of restoring trust and hope through recognition that the people who are responsible for the election process are not some mythical people behind curtains, but our friends and neighbors. And that allows us to make, I think, more connection but to that and the results.
Great. Ben or Justin, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, only that there's so much sort of churn and turmoil about this issue tells you how important it is. That no matter where you fall on the political divide, you can't deny the importance of who ends up leading us over the next 4 years. And so losing faith in democracy becomes sort of a downward spiral that is, I think, helpful to point out to people who feel it makes no sense to vote, because you just can't read or watch about this election and think it's not going to matter.
Yeah, I love the local focus. The truth of the matter is, it's simply not true that your vote doesn't matter, and that's much more apparent on a local level. It's true on a national level, but it's more apparent on a local level. And one thing that I've been saying for a while is understand that your community, your church or your synagogue or whatever, can have more of an impact on the community around it than whoever is going to get elected in November. And that's something to hang on to, that you can have a bigger impact on people around you than who's ever going to get elected. And that's not to say they don't have any impact, but your impact could very well be larger and more immediate.
That's so valuable. And we have a question from a global perspective here. There are more than 50 elections affecting half the planet's population planned for this year. Could you share your experiences on global awareness and the connections of the US election that have global impact and interdependence? I know that we're all pretty US focused on the call here. I can take this one if no one else wants to, but want to
I just dropped a meme set kind of in response to that. This is the way that we've handled kind of asking voters to think about this issue who are American, to kind of think about interdependence, international cooperation. I don't know if it's as sophisticated of an answer of what you're looking for, but this is one way to kind of talk about it with your community, the importance of thinking about this issue.
Absolutely. And I'll add one thing that we are looking at Protect Democracy is we are instituted as an organization trying to ensure that the US does not fall into a more authoritarian form of government. So we'll be looking at how are the elections being run generally, globally, and what can we learn from that? But also, what are we seeing as far as authoritarianism, either increasing or decreasing abroad? And the last thing I just say is this sort of patriotic sense as an American that we are the leading democracy in the world. We are who a lot of the global community turn to see whether a democracy can long endure, as Abraham Lincoln said. So I think we also, the way that I think as an American about the global impact of elections is also that we are still the marquee democracy in the world, and we have to be proving that every day. And I think that we are up to that challenge. See, another question that we had received ahead of time is, could you discuss the makeup of 2024 election workers? Are they committed to a fair election? And Ben, I think you've had the most conversations with election officials. I'd love you to take this one first, if you don't mind.
One of the things that's impressed me the most in my work is the dedication of election officials. I do believe that even the ones who are elected partisanly believe in putting on fair and accurate elections. And so, yes, I do believe that election workers and officials are committed to and will provide a fair and accurate count, and not put their thumbs on the scale in the ways which they're being accused of. And again, the way to check that, if you're a doubter of it, is local. I mean, go in and check your communities and see if it's true.
Emma or Justin, do you have anything to add on that one?
I'm going to drop another link in response to that of an example of an MWEG member who's an election worker. So I think if you have doubts about election workers, go volunteer to be one yourself and encourage your friends and family to do so. And that's one of the most proactive things you can do.
Right. And we don't have perfect elections, but what we do have are safeguards in place that help ensure that even if there are mistakes that are made, even if there are bad actors, there are systems in place to catch those things. And I'll just share a quick story because I think it's important to think of, and there are campaigns from Issue One and other organizations around the faces of democracy. Who are the people actually running our elections? And our task force on election crises that I staff at Protect Democracy went to New Hampshire to see the first real votes being cast since the 2020 election during the New Hampshire primary earlier this year. And the polling location that we went to observe, the person who was running the whole election at that precinct recognized my last name. I grew up in Nashua, New Hampshire. He recognized my last name. He had been the music director for a number of plays that my brother was involved in. So this person has a day-to-day life that doesn't revolve around elections, but he steps up in this way and serves the community in that way. And when we were watching as the polls closed and they locked the doors and started the count, I was talking to the police officer who was at that polling location. And he said, I'm not a political guy. I don't really get involved in politics, but I wish everybody who had questions about how this stuff works or think there's some big conspiracy going on could just come see these people. They're old people. They're a little bit nerdy. They take this really seriously, and it's really cool. So I like those anecdotes of just what we saw in that one location. That's what's going on with millions of people. And it's also why we want to invite people into this process as poll workers, is I think if you invite people in and say, we want you to be a part of this work, we want you to see yourself in our democracy, and they'll go through the training and serve their community, they'll see by and large what we saw in Nashua, New Hampshire. All right, I think this will be the last question before we have the opportunity for people to do breakout groups if you're interested in it. And this question is, what can we do to prevent voting interference? How do we determine what's true in campaign speeches and publications? So let's go with the first half of that question first. And I'll sort of toss it up for whoever wants to take it.
Chris, I think it depends a little bit on what you mean about voting interference. I think that local election officials actually have the responsibility of being clear that there is not voter interference. I mean, that takes on broader ramifications in the cybersecurity area where it's really a government-wide program to make sure there's not voting interference. But I do find that on a local basis, election officials are working with both political parties and with law enforcement to ensure that there's not interference at the polls.
In reference to the second question, I would kind of go back to part of what Emma was saying before. When someone gives a speech or there's a, whatever, especially when we're talking about the presidential election, whatever somebody says, there's no lack of critique. I think what we have to do is get a variety of that critique, see who is kind of bringing, hey, actually he said this, but here's what he actually signed, or here's what she actually did. You just kind of have to look around a little bit to find different critiques from different spaces, and that'll give you an idea on what was real and what isn't. But thankfully, there isn't a lack of critique. Some are, use more, are more founded than others. But over time, I think we begin to be able to see that.
Thank you very much. And we are just about at 4 o'clock. I want to see, Emma, if you just have any final comments. Ben and Justin got a last word there. Do you have any last comments before I close?
I do not. That was beautiful what everyone said.
Great. Well, thank you again to everyone who tuned in. Thank you to our panelists. This was a really wonderful conversation. I think it was actionable. I also think we might have had, if not optimism, a lot of hope and a lot of tools for how we can bring hope to our communities and do this work in effective ways. I'm going to hand it over now to my friends at Interfaith America to discuss the opportunity that folks have to stay on the line here and go into small groups to follow up if you're interested. Thank you all very much.